What kind of man digs his own grave at dawn? That was the question hanging over the dry Texas wind the morning Ezekiel Thornfield took a shovel to the hard sun-baked earth behind his cabin. 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, deep enough to bury 37 years of pain failure and heartbreak. A failed rancher, a widower, a man forgotten by the world and ready to forget himself. The sun hadn't even cleared the hills when he planned it all out. Dig until noon, write a letter, load his father's revolver, and pull the trigger before the bank took the land and his name became dust. No one was coming to stop him. No one ever had. But fate doesn't knock. Sometimes it crashes through the gate, bleeding and breathless. Just as Ezekiel lifted the shovel for what he thought would be the last time, a voice cracked, desperate echoed through the stillness. And when he turned the corner of that lonely cabin, he found her a girl no older than 20, collapsed, torn dress, clinging to a body heavy with child, blood at her feet, fever in her eyes, and a whisper that would break even the hardest man. "Please don't let my baby die." That was the moment everything changed, because this story isn't about a man who wanted to die. It's about how a stranger gave him a reason to live and fight. What kind of man digs his own grave before breakfast? Not a madman, not a coward, but a man who's run out of reasons to keep standing in a world that's already buried him, in silence, regret, and dust. That was Ezekiel Thornfield on that dry Texas morning when the sky hadn't yet decided if it would burn or break. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge, but his back already ached from the labor. He wiped his calloused hand across a face carved with time and sorrow, blinked away sweat that stung his eyes like penance, and stared at the half-dug grave behind his cabin. 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, the measurements of defeat. Every strike of the shovel was a silent confession of everything he'd lost and everything he'd failed to become. His wife Sarah had died 2 winters ago, fever burning through her pregnant body like wildfire, and when the baby went with her, something in Ezekiel did too. What remained was a husk of a man who spoke to no one, trusted no one, and prayed for nothing. His cattle had withered in the drought, his savings had run dry, and the bank had made its last threat clear: give up the land or be dragged off it. But it wasn't the money or the dirt that broke him. It was the silence, the kind that seeps into your bones at night, the kind that speaks in the creaks of floorboards and the hollow sound of an unused rocking chair. He hadn't heard another voice in weeks, hadn't been touched by another human hand in months. Grief, he'd learned, doesn't shout, it whispers. And it keeps whispering until you believe what it says, that you're already gone. So he made a plan. Finish the hole by midday, clean his boots not out of vanity but respect. Write a short letter not to anyone in particular but for the sake of his own dignity. Sign over the deed to the bank what little of it they'd still want. And then sit in the old chair his father built, open the drawer, take out the revolver that had once defended cattle and now would be used for silence. Simple, clean, no drama. Just one last honest day of work. He thought about what it might feel like, the trigger, the noise, the nothing that came after. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Death to Ezekiel was no longer a shadow. It was a companion. The only thing that hadn't left him. Still, as he struck the shovel into the hardened soil again, something resisted. Not in the ground, but in his chest. Not doubt he'd already settled the matter. But a question, one that he'd been too afraid to say aloud. Is this really all there is? No answer came, just the wind and the groan of a dry tree limb overhead. He wiped the sweat from his brow, stared down at the hole, and imagined himself in it. Would anyone come looking? Would anyone mark the grave? He doubted it. The neighbors were 2 valleys over. The preacher had moved east, and the only soul who might have mourned him had died cradling his hand while whispering the name they never got to give their child. He had nothing left. No bloodline, no fortune, no future. And so he kept digging. The labor gave rhythm to his emptiness, the burn in his arms, the only reminder that he was still tethered to a body. He didn't think about legacy or forgiveness or redemption. Those belonged to better men. Men who hadn't failed their wives. Men who still believed God was listening. All he had was the dirt, the heat, and the promise of silence. And yet even in his resolve, something felt unfinished. The ground gave resistance in ways it hadn't before. The earth felt different, like it knew what he was doing, like it was challenging him. Is this how it ends? That's when he heard it. Not a voice at first, but a tremor. A sound foreign to the stillness of his world, soft, human, desperate, and then unmistakably a woman's voice cracking through the air like thunder in a drought. "Help! Please!" He froze. The shovel slipped from his hand and landed against the ground with a dull thud. That wasn't wind. That wasn't memory. That was someone alive. A voice, real, trembling, feminine, cutting through the dust, like an echo of life. He turned toward the sound rifle, already in hand instinctively. The land had grown hostile in recent months, and he'd heard stories, land thieves, raiders, desperate men who didn't knock before taking. He rounded the corner of the cabin, expecting trouble, maybe a setup, maybe the end coming sooner than he planned. But what he saw stopped him cold. A young woman, barely 20, collapsed against his front gate. Her dress torn, her hair matted with dust and blood, and her belly swollen with life impossibly full, like she was weeks from giving birth. Maybe days, maybe hours. She looked up at him with fevered eyes, lips barely moving, one hand on her stomach, the other reaching out like a dying branch. Her voice, barely more than breath, reached him like a sacred plea. "Please, don't let my baby die." And just like that, everything Ezekiel thought he knew unraveled. The grave, the plan, the certainty. It all faded in the face of that one broken woman, and the life she was fighting to bring into a world that had nearly destroyed her. For the first time in 2 years, Ezekiel felt something shift. A pulse, a purpose, maybe even a second chance. And in that single moment he understood this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of something he hadn't dared imagine, a reason to live. The moment Ezekiel saw her, everything stopped, the heat, the wind, even the ache in his chest he'd been carrying like a second heartbeat. She was barely standing, her body slumped against his splintered wooden gate like a rag doll left in the dirt. Dust clung to her skin. Her face was ghost pale under the midday sun, and her eyes, what little he could see of them through the mess of tangled, sweat-soaked hair, were glazed with fever. She couldn't have been older than 20, and yet she looked like she'd lived through 10 lifetimes of suffering. Her dress, once perhaps a soft shade of cream or blue, was torn and blood-stained, clinging to her body in tatters, and her rounded belly, too large, too low, made it clear that she was far along in her pregnancy, maybe days, maybe hours from giving birth. Ezekiel approached slowly, rifle held tight but no longer pointed. Whatever threat he expected, this wasn't it. This wasn't a trap or a thief or some desperate squatter. This was someone who had run until her legs gave out, someone whose body was giving way, whose very presence was a whisper against the scream of the sun. As he stepped closer, the girl's lips moved, barely forming words, her cracked mouth too dry to deliver sound, but he could read the plea written across her face, as clear as scripture, "Help me." His hands, calloused and worn, lowered the rifle without thought. Whatever walls he had built to survive the last 2 years, whatever emotional armor he had wrapped around himself to numb the pain, it all cracked the second he saw the blood trickling down her leg and the way she cradled her belly like a fragile promise. He moved to the gate and unlatched it, his boots kicking up dust as he crossed the few feet that had just, moments before, separated life from death. His death. She collapsed into his arms before he could say a word. He caught her with more instinct than grace, surprised by how little she weighed, how fragile she felt, despite carrying a whole other life inside her. She wasn't just exhausted, she was burning up. Her skin was hot to the touch, her breathing ragged and shallow. Fever, blood loss, possibly worse. And the baby. He didn't know much about childbirth, but even he could tell this wasn't how it was supposed to go. He looked down into her face, searching for clarity, and found her eyelids fluttering, her mouth twitching as she forced herself to speak. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice no louder than the wind through dead grass. "They said they'd find me, no matter where I ran." Ezekiel's blood ran cold. He didn't need to ask who they were. In this land, a woman didn't end up like this unless someone evil had put her there. He carried her inside, laying her on the same bed where he'd planned to write his final letter, and only then did he allow himself to see her clearly, really see her. Beneath the dirt and bruises, her features were delicate, almost fragile, but streaked with the kind of resilience that only suffering could carve into a face. She wasn't just a girl in trouble, she was a survivor. But the marks on her body told a deeper story: rope burns on her wrists, hand-shaped bruises on her arms, a deep scratch across her collarbone. Someone had restrained her. Someone had used force. And somehow she had gotten away. Ezekiel's mind raced as he began to clean her wounds, soaking cloth in water he fetched from the well, pressing them gently against her skin as she drifted in and out of consciousness. He had no medical training, no doctor's hands, just the memory of how he used to care for his wife during her final days, how every moment was a battle between hope and inevitability. As he worked, the girl's eyes opened again, wide with fear, but this time there was fire in them. "My name is Celeste," she said more clearly now. "My father sold me to a man named Virgil Blackwood. He said it would pay off his gambling debt." Ezekiel froze. He knew that name. Every rancher within 100 miles knew it. Virgil Blackwood wasn't just a land baron, he was a predator cloaked in wealth. The kind of man who controlled judges, sheriffs, and water rights. The kind of man who made girls disappear without consequence. Ezekiel swallowed hard as Celeste went on, her voice, trembling but gathering strength. "He kept me locked in his house for 3 months, said the baby was his property, that he'd raise it to be just like him. But when I went into labor early, I ran, stole a horse, rode until it collapsed. Then I walked." Ezekiel felt a surge of rage unlike anything he'd known, not the quiet, bitter kind that he'd stewed in for the past 2 years. This was sharp, alive burning, and for the first time since Sarah died, he wasn't angry at the universe or fate. He was angry at a man who saw women as possessions, babies, as legacies of control. A man who would no doubt stop at nothing to reclaim what he thought belonged to him. Ezekiel stood and moved to the window, scanning the horizon. His ranch sat low in the land, surrounded by open plains and distant hills, great for spotting trouble, terrible for hiding from it. If Blackwood had her scent, he could already be on the way. The shovel still lay outside, glinting in the sun beside the half-dug grave, a cruel reminder of the choice Ezekiel had intended to make that day. But now the choice had changed. He wasn't burying himself. He might soon be burying someone else, unless somehow he found the will to fight again. Not for himself, but for the baby, for Celeste, for whatever shred of goodness might still be salvaged in this God-forsaken stretch of Texas. As Ezekiel knelt beside the battered girl lying on his bed where only hours earlier he had planned to take his own life, he felt an ache that went deeper than grief, deeper than guilt. It was something close to shame, like he'd looked too long into a mirror and finally saw the man he'd become, someone who had surrendered. But now, with Celeste's broken body stretched across the blankets, the idea of surrender felt like cowardice. She had crawled out of a hell he couldn't even fathom. Every tremor in her breath, Every twitch of pain across her young face told a story that shook the foundation of everything he thought he understood about suffering. She wasn't just running from someone, she was running from something evil. Ezekiel leaned in as her eyes flickered open again, blinking through fever sweat and memory. She spoke slowly, her voice dry but steady, like someone too tired to lie. "My name is Celeste," she began again, her lips cracked and trembling. "My father, he sold me, said it was either me or his legs." The words hit Ezekiel like a blow to the chest. She paused, breathing through the pain, then continued. "He owed money gambling whiskey cards. Virgil Blackwood came to collect. My father offered the only thing he still owned." She looked down toward her belly, her expression darkening. "Me." Ezekiel sat back, his hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles went white. He had heard stories about Blackwood, everyone had. A rich man with too much land and too many secrets. He wasn't just a rancher or a tycoon. He was a man who believed people were possessions. Girls disappeared around him. Land changed hands through fear, not deals. And the law, it bent for him like grass in the wind. "He took me to his house," Celeste said, eyes glazed over as she recounted the nightmare. "Locked every door. No windows opened. I wasn't allowed outside, not even to walk." Her voice faltered as the memories surfaced. "He told me I was his now, that the child would be his heir, that I should be grateful he didn't throw me in a ditch like the others." The others. That word stuck in Ezekiel's mind like a splinter. How many? How long had this monster been doing this? And how many fathers had sold their daughters into silence? He looked at her wrists again. The rope burns were deep, angry marks of ownership. Her arms bore bruises, fingers pressed too tightly, held too long. She'd been restrained, manhandled, maybe worse. But she was here. She'd escaped. Somehow. And that said more about her than all her words combined. 3 months, she whispered, a tear slipping from the corner of her eye. 3 months in that house. I counted every day by how many times the food tray came. That's all I had. A tray through a slot in the door. I didn't see the sky until the day I ran. Her breathing grew faster, more ragged. Ezekiel reached for the basin again, dipping a cloth and placing it gently on her forehead. She closed her eyes at the touch, more from exhaustion than trust. He said I'd give birth in his house, that he'd raise the baby like himself. Cold, cruel, obedient. But I couldn't let that happen. Not to my child. Her voice broke now, for the first time, the weight of it cracking through. So when the pain started early, I waited until the guard was drunk. I took his keys. I stole a horse, rode until it died under me. And then I walked. Ezekiel didn't know what stunned him more, the horror of what she'd lived through, or the sheer will it must have taken to get to his doorstep. A girl, full-term pregnant, hemorrhaging, half-starved, and still running. And not for herself, for her baby. His jaw tightened as he stood and moved back toward the window, heart pounding. This wasn't just a girl who needed help. This was a target. If Blackwood had even the faintest idea of where she'd gone, he'd come after her. And he wouldn't come alone. Ezekiel scanned the distant hills. The sky was too clear. The road too quiet. It wasn't comfort, it was warning. Too much silence meant the storm hadn't arrived yet. But it was coming, and he had no doubt that when it did, it would come with fire and steel. He turned back towards Celeste. Her breath hitched and her body arched in pain. The sheets beneath her were wet, not with sweat, but something darker. "It's happening," she gasped. "The baby. It's coming." Ezekiel felt his pulse spike. He'd helped birth calves before. But this wasn't livestock. This was a human life. 2 of them, actually. And one of them was already fading. He moved to her side, trying to calm her, trying to remember everything his wife had told him when she was pregnant. But nothing prepared him for this. Not the fear in Celeste's eyes, not the smell of blood, not the rising sense that he was about to lose both of them before the sun set. And through it all, a new thought emerged like smoke, curling out of a long-dead fire. He couldn't let them die here. Not like this. Not in the same place he'd planned to end his own life. He had walked into this day expecting to die in silence. Now he was being asked, no dare to fight for life. Not his, theirs. And as he held her hand and whispered that it was going to be okay, even though he wasn't sure it would be Ezekiel Thornfield once broken, now, Burning understood something that made his chest tighten with terrifying clarity. This was no longer just a wounded girl he was trying to save. This was justice, innocence, and redemption bleeding out in his bed. And if Virgil Blackwood came looking for his property, Ezekiel was going to show him exactly how wrong he was. As the sun dipped lower behind the hills, casting long golden rays across the arid Texas dirt, Ezekiel Thornfield knew that time was no longer on their side. Inside the cabin, Celeste was slipping fast, her skin ghost white and slick with sweat, her body convulsing with each painful contraction, as the child inside her fought to be born into a world already threatening to tear them both apart. The sheets beneath her were stained dark, far too dark for what he thought normal, and though he'd never delivered a child in his life, some ancient instinct in him told him this was wrong. Too much blood, too little strength left in her eyes. He could feel her life draining away with every minute, and yet she gritted her teeth and bore down with a kind of determination that was nothing short of holy. But outside, hell was brewing. He heard it before he saw it, the rhythmic thudding of hooves against the earth, like thunder rolling in without warning. Ezekiel moved to the window rifle in hand, heart pounding in his chest. Dust was rising in the distance. 6 riders, fast and tight in formation, approaching from the east ridge, with the kind of discipline only trained men carried. And at their head rode a figure that made his blood run cold, tall, lean, with silver hair, catching the light, and cold, calculating eyes that scanned the landscape like a predator. Virgil Blackwood. He had come for what he claimed was his, and he'd brought enough firepower to make sure no one stood in his way. Ezekiel ducked below the window frame, heart racing, his mind caught in the impossible math of the moment. Inside, a dying girl, a baby fighting to be born, no doctor for 50 miles, and a cabin built to trap heat and bullets. Outside, 6 armed men, likely all ex-military or mercenary, trained to kill and follow orders without question. He had a rifle, an old 6-shot pistol, and a handful of bullets. That was it. No cavalry, no backup, no plan. But what he did have was a promise one made, not with ceremony, but in blood and sweat and tears. Celeste had looked him in the eye and begged him not to let her baby die. And now, as her body screamed and her breaths came in panicked gasps, Ezekiel understood that promise didn't end with comfort. It came with war. He rushed back to her side, clutching a clean cloth in shaking hands, as he tried to soak away the fever from her forehead. "Stay with me," he said, his voice both command and plea. "Don't you leave that baby alone." Celeste barely nodded, her strength hanging by a thread. Another contraction racked her body, and she screamed, arching off the bed, as her water finally broke, in a rush that soaked through the blanket and onto the floor. Ezekiel had no time to hesitate. He reached for more cloth, steadying her legs as best he could, praying silently to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. "Come on, little one," he muttered. "You got to make this quick." But the child had its own timing, and so did Blackwood. A shot rang out sharp and sudden, shattering the front window and sending glass across the floor in a deadly scatter. Ezekiel dropped low, heart thundering, as Celeste whimpered behind him, not from the gunfire, but from the agony tearing through her. "He's here," she gasped. "He's really here." Ezekiel crawled to the door and peeked through a crack in the wall. The men had taken position, fanning out their rifles, pointed toward the cabin like they'd done this a dozen times before. Blackwood stood tall in the saddle, calm and composed. "Time's up, Thornfield," he shouted. "I know she's in there. That girl is my property, and what's inside her belongs to me." The words dripped with ownership, like he was talking about livestock or land, not a woman who had nearly died escaping his grasp. Ezekiel grit his teeth. "She's not your property," he muttered under his breath. "She's human. And that baby's free." Another contraction, and Celeste screamed louder than before. Ezekiel turned just in time to see the baby's head crowning. It was happening, right now, in the middle of a siege. With shaking hands, he guided the infant into the world, the blood, the fluid, the trembling chaos all happening in the space of seconds. The child emerged, tiny, slick, and silent for a terrifying moment, until a thin, strong cry pierced the room like a trumpet blast through smoke. The baby was alive. A girl. He quickly wiped her down, wrapped her in one of his shirts, and cradled her in his arms. Celeste, barely conscious, opened her eyes and stared at her daughter. Her lips moved, forming one final word with the last of her breath. "Rose." Then her body went still. Ezekiel stared at her, at the child she had died to bring into the world, and felt something he hadn't felt in years, a righteous kind of rage, a need to protect. Not just out of duty, but because this child, this tiny crying flame of life, was proof that something pure could still exist in this brutal world, that someone's sacrifice still meant something. Outside, Blackwood's voice boomed again. "I smell smoke, Thornfield. You won't hand her over, we'll burn you out." Ezekiel looked around and saw the flames already licking at the far walls. The bastards had set fire to the cabin. He was running out of time. He tucked baby Rose tightly against his chest, kissed Celeste's forehead one last time, and whispered, "I'll keep her safe. You have my word." Then, with the walls collapsing and smoke choking the air, he made his move not toward death, but toward survival, toward justice, toward whatever future might still be clawed from the ashes. Smoke choked the air inside the cabin, thick and bitter, curling like serpents around the rafters as flames licked greedily at the wooden beams above. The cries of baby Rose rose higher with every passing second, urgent and panicked, as if the newborn sensed the world she'd been born into was already trying to consume her. Ezekiel held her tightly against his chest, her tiny heartbeat fluttering like a trapped bird beneath his shirt. The fire had spread faster than he'd expected. The east wall was already gone, and the ceiling above the kitchen sagged with the weight of flame. His boots crunched over burning debris as he made his way toward the back of the cabin, his mind a blur of instinct, adrenaline, and fury. He knew there was no time to mourn, no time to second-guess. Celeste was gone. Her body still lay on the blood-soaked bed where she'd whispered her daughter's name with her final breath. But her soul, whatever it was that had kept her crawling through dust and pain and fear, was not gone. It lived in the infant, in his arms. And Ezekiel Thornfield, who'd been digging his own grave only hours earlier, now knew exactly why he hadn't finished it. He kicked open the back cellar door, the hinges groaning as it gave way to a dark set of steps leading into the root cellar. He ducked in, covering the baby with his coat to shield her from the ash and heat every motion, deliberate and fast. The air inside was damp and heavy but breathable. For now. He crouched low, moved toward the hidden exit behind the old water barrel that backed against the cabin's rear. That second entrance had always been there, a leftover from his father's paranoia about raiders and war parties. Today it might just be salvation. As he reached the rear hatch and shoved it open, sunlight and smoke spilled in together, and with them the sound of shouted orders. Blackwood was close, closer than Ezekiel had hoped. "Push around the back, check the root cellar. That child is worth more than all of you combined." The words made Ezekiel's blood boil. That child, not Rose, not a person, just a possession, a thing with a value, a price, a future carved in someone else's image. Ezekiel's jaw tightened as he peeked around the water barrel, taking stock of the enemy's position. Two men on horseback guarded the north flank, while another circled toward the barn. But what Ezekiel hadn't expected, what filled him with a flicker of hope, was what he saw by the water trough, three of Blackwood's men unconscious, tied up with their own ropes. Standing over them, revolver in hand, was a figure dressed in trail dust and purpose, Deputy Marshal Kate Sullivan. She was the only law officer in 2 counties who hadn't been bought by Blackwood's silver, and she looked like she'd just ridden through hell to get there. Afternoon, Ezekiel, she called calmly, not taking her eyes off the one conscious man trying to crawl away. Heard there might be trouble. He moved quickly toward her, clutching the crying infant. Blackwood's inside, he said. Cabin's going up. Celeste didn't make it. Kate's jaw tightened. She took one look at the child and holstered her weapon with practiced care. Get her out of here. I'll handle him. But Ezekiel shook his head. No, he's mine. The last word came out lower than he meant, almost like a growl. Kate hesitated, then nodded. Then let's end it. Together they moved guns, drawn the flames behind them, casting flickering shadows across the dirt as they circled back toward the front porch. The structure groaned behind them, collapsing inward as fire consumed what had once been a home and what had for a moment become a sanctuary. Blackwood stood in the doorway, pistol in hand, smoke curling around him like a demon risen from its lair. His face was blackened with soot, his silver hair disheveled, and his eyes, those cold, inhuman eyes, locked onto the bundle in Ezekiel's arms with predatory intensity. Give her to me, he ordered, voice hoarse from smoke, but still commanding. She's mine by law. Kate stepped forward, badge glinting in the firelight. That law was bought. I've got testimony, witnesses, and signed statements. You're done, Blackwood. But he wasn't listening. His gaze never left Rose. You think you can take my legacy, he hissed. I built this land. I made it with blood. She carries my blood. She belongs to me. Ezekiel's grip tightened. She's not your legacy, he said quietly. She's Celeste's. And Celeste died trying to make sure you never got near her again. Blackwood's hand twitched toward his gun. Kate raised hers in warning. Don't. But he didn't stop. In one swift motion, he reached for his weapon. Ezekiel stepped forward without flinching, shielding the baby with his body, just as Kate's revolver fired. The shot cracked the air like thunder, and Blackwood staggered backward, blood blooming across his chest like a red flower in the firelight. He fell to his knees, eyes wide with shock, then collapsed into the dirt as flames behind him danced higher into the sky. Silence fell, except for the baby's soft cry, the last remaining voice of the fallen. Ezekiel looked down at her, then at the burning remains of everything he had once been. He had nothing now, no house, no cattle, no wife. But in his arms he held a child born of tragedy, carried through fire and shielded by sacrifice. And somehow that made him feel richer than he'd ever been. Kate stepped beside him, watching the flames with quiet understanding. So what now? She asked. Ezekiel looked toward the open land ahead, the smoke curling into the horizon like a curtain pulled back for a new scene. Now, he said, adjusting Rose gently in his arms, we start again. From the ashes. The sun had nearly vanished beneath the jagged Texas horizon, leaving behind streaks of crimson and gold across the sky like war paint on a wounded land. Smoke still curled lazily into the air from what remained of the cabin, now a charred skeleton of ash and memory, its final embers glowing like ghostly coals in the dust. Ezekiel Thornfield stood a short distance away, baby Rose nestled quietly in the crook of his arm, wrapped in a shirt that still bore faint traces of Celeste's scent lavender dust, and something impossibly brave. He looked down at the girl's peaceful face, her tiny hand curled into his coat, like she already knew this was home. And as he stood there, boots planted firm in the dirt of a world he'd once tried to leave behind, Ezekiel realized that something had shifted inside him so completely, so irreversibly it could only be called rebirth. 6 hours ago, he'd been digging his own grave behind this very house, not out of cowardice, but out of hopelessness, the kind that creeps in slow and silent, like drought, drying out every drop of purpose until nothing's left but cracked soil and a loaded gun. He'd believed the world had taken everything from him, his land strangled by dust, his dreams foreclosed by a banker's signature, his wife and unborn child buried by winter and fever. He had stared into that hole and seen nothing but finality. But now, looking into the wide blue eyes of this newborn, he saw something else, a future, a vow, a fight worth seeing through. The grave still sat there behind the house untouched since the moment Celeste cried out for help. He would finish digging it, but not for himself, not for the man who once gave up. He would dig it for her. Celeste deserved more than fire and ruin. She deserved a resting place beneath open skies where wildflowers might someday bloom and her daughter could sit quietly in the grass and remember the mother who gave everything for her freedom. Ezekiel would carve her name into stone with his own hands, not because it was easy, but because it mattered. As the first stars pricked through the twilight above, Kate Sullivan stood beside him, her rifle slung over her shoulder, her badge catching the last light of day. She watched him without speaking, giving space to the silence, understanding that some moments were meant to settle deep before they were disturbed. Finally, she asked the question lingering between them. What happens now? Ezekiel didn't answer right away. He watched as Rose blinked sleepily, her breaths slow and even unaware of the violence she had survived, the evil she had escaped. He thought about the years ahead, not as a farmer, not even as a soldier, but as a father. The kind of father he never had. The kind of man who doesn't walk away when life gets hard, but plants his feet and builds something from the dust. He looked out at the broken fencing, the scattered tools, the land that once felt cursed, and now seemed filled with the promise of something new. Now, he said, finally, voice low and steady, "We build a life worth living." Kate gave a quiet nod, a trace of a smile playing on her lips. She knew the weight of those words, the gravity behind them. Not everyone gets a second chance. Fewer still grab it with both hands and turn it into something beautiful. Ezekiel Thornfield had come within a whisper of giving up, and instead had found a reason to rise. They walked together toward the edge of the property where Kate's horse was tied. Rose stirred gently in Ezekiel's arms, letting out a soft sigh. "We'll ride into town at first light," Kate said. "I'll help you file the paperwork. With Blackwood dead, his so-called guardianship is void. You'll need to make it official." Ezekiel nodded. He wasn't afraid of that kind of fight. Not anymore. The legal battles, the land disputes, the suspicious stares from townsfolk who still whispered behind hands, none of it scared him, because none of them had seen what he had. None of them had buried the past in ash and flame and risen from it carrying the future in their arms. "Thank you," he said simply. Kate tipped her hat. "Just doing my job." But they both knew it was more than that. She hadn't just upheld the law, she'd helped birth something rare in a land like this: justice. Real, unflinching justice. As night settled in, Ezekiel laid a blanket beside the fire pit, where the heat was gentler, where Rose could sleep safely under the stars. He sat beside her rifle within reach, eyes scanning the horizon with the practiced gaze of a man who knew danger might still be out there, but who no longer feared it. Because this time he had something to protect. This time he had something to live for. As the wind moved across the plains, rustling the grass and carrying the faint scent of smoke and sage, Ezekiel looked skyward and whispered a quiet prayer, not just for Celeste, but for every broken soul who needed a reason to keep going. "Let this be hers," he said softly, glancing at Rose. "Let her grow strong. Let her grow free." And in that moment, under a sky stretched wide and eternal, with a baby wrapped in cloth and cradled beside a man reborn, something truly rare happened. A new story began. One not written by fate, but forged in fire and sealed by love. Life has a way of breaking us before it rebuilds us. Sometimes it buries us so deep in pain, loss, or loneliness that we forget what it means to hope. That's where Ezekiel Thornfield began digging a grave, not just in the ground, but in his soul. And yet, from that same soil, a second chance was born. The lesson is clear: no matter how far we fall, no matter how much we lose, purpose can still find us. It may come in the cry of a newborn, in the hand of a stranger, or in the fire that forces us to fight one last time. Redemption isn't about forgetting the past. It's about choosing what we do next. Ezekiel chose to protect, to stand up, to live not for himself, but for someone who needed him. That choice didn't make life easier, but it made it meaningful. If you're standing at the edge right now, tired, angry, lost, remember this. Even the most broken heart can become a sanctuary. Even the man with nothing left can become the hero in someone else's story. Sometimes it's not about starting over. It's about deciding that today is not the day you give up.